Well, a very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia. We are launching a new lecture series, Coffee with a Foreign Correspondent or a Correspondent, a Photographer. This will be a monthly series. This also begins the launch of our coffee place. It's called Breaking Brews. And I'm pleased to introduce Emily Schmall. She works for Associated Press, and she will be anchoring the show. And we are delighted to invite you, Bryan and Denton. He is a photojournalist. He works for the New York Times. So without much ado, welcome to you all. And I hand over the microphone to Emily, please.
Okay, thank you. We'll just get Bryan a coffee and me one too.
No, it's okay. Just black is fine.
Okay, so welcome everybody to our first lecture series, Coffee with a Correspondent. Really, really happy to have Bryan Denton here. As Venkat said, he is a contributing photojournalist for the New York Times. He's reported on conflict and uprising, on climate and other humanitarian disasters across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And we brought him here tonight to talk about one of his recent pieces, looking at the peril that India faces soon, estimates say as soon as 2050, with both having too little water and sometimes too much of it. So I think we've all written about that or taken photos of it, but I think what Bryan and his colleague at the New York Times did, which was really, really unique in terms of how they chose to tell this story. So take it away.
Well, thank you all for coming. I've had a day of consecutive disasters, including the power basically exploding at my house, so I apologize for the sort of rough and fast version of the slideshow. I had something very nice put together, but it's trapped on my computer right now. But yeah, as Emily said, I've been focusing actually more recently on climate change as a topic. I used to cover, sort of conflict and humanitarian issues, but as I get older, and really since I moved to India, I've decided that I think, looking at how people are already experiencing the effects of climate change is sort of one of the defining stories of our time, moving forward in the coming decades. And India faces particular challenges based on, geographically where it's located, but also with how, the government has enacted, policy over the last 6 or 7 decades, since independence and before independence. And I thought that one of the interesting ways to do this would be to sort of do an audit of India's relationship with its water resources. That was my original idea. And I worked to shape it with Samini Sengupta, who's one of the lead climate reporters at the New York Times. And so we sort of settled on this idea of looking at how a changing monsoon is going to impact the lives of, not just the lives of Indians, but also the economy, and is going to sort of change the country. And so I started looking at the cycle. Basically, I started exploring without a really firm idea of where this was all going to end up. Our idea went through a few iterations. At a moment, it was going to not only include water, but it was going to include earth and air. So I ran around like a chicken with my head cut off for most of the year. But we ended up settling back on water. And so I started out covering drought, but it ended up sort of going back and forth between flooding and then drought and then back to flooding and areas where people were experiencing sort of extreme water stress. And so if you want to move through the next slide. So it started out in Mumbai, and then this is just the beginning of the story that sort of introduces, the sort of concepts that we're moving through, which is floods, and then drought. This was in UP. And then you can go to the next one. And then we also obviously wanted to look at how India's infrastructure, water infrastructure, has sort of contributed to some of the issues that India is currently facing with water shortages. And so this is a water distribution in Chennai, which experienced, sort of basically ran out of water this summer, as you all remember. You can go to the next one. And then the So this year Mumbai experienced, I think, its wettest year in 65 years. And Mumbai is threatened not only by sea level rises, but also by sort of the man-made issues surrounding, the development, particularly of the Mithi River, which, had a disastrous, flooding in, I believe, 10 years ago. In 2005 was when it broke its banks. And so this year the Mithi flooded again. And this was taken in the Sion neighborhood where, it wasn't cataclysmic, but everybody sort of seems to have, it's becoming a more frequent occurrence as mangroves are pulled up, as more natural channels are paved over which prevents, water from being absorbed into the ground. A lot of the natural defenses are disappearing. And when you combine that with sea level rises, it makes the problem even worse, especially when high tides come. So. And then another thing that I focused on here, a sort of broader theme, is just pollution and how the government has contributed to the sort of how government policy over decades has sort of contributed to the in many ways the defiling of the of the natural ecosystem here. And there's been underinvestment in infrastructure, but at the same time, for the purposes of greed, developers have been able to pave over and diminish a lot of the natural creeks and things that would have kept, that would have replenished groundwater. Wastewater is not being dealt with in a great way. So I thought that was a important part of the story to tell as well. So. And then in addition to there being, increasing numbers of extreme rainfall events over the past 6 decades, you're also seeing less steady rain, which leads to drought. This was taken in Matawada, Maharashtra, which is, has seen a documented decline in rainfall over the last 9 to 15 years, basically. Which has left dams like this, which were supposed to provide drinking water to communities, completely dry, basically, right after the monsoon, when they're supposed to be full. And there's another sort of political dynamic to this photograph as well, which is that that area, just up the road from that area, there are just swaths of sugarcane that are being grown in a highly water-stressed area, which doesn't have a lot of rivers running through it. And that's because politicians and their friends have built a lot of sugarcane mills, sugar mills in the area. And that has, been a big economic boom to them, particularly because the Indian government provides subsidies to them for electricity, and which they use to pump out groundwater. But at the same time, it's the economic policy is not only not in line with sort of the coming climate change challenges that the area is going to face, but they're exacerbating them. So it's a bit of a it's ironic. It's tragic. So go to the next one. And then I also explored a lot of Eastern UP, and this place, which I found it was a place called Parsoi, which is in Sonbhadra district. And it was probably the most remote place I visited, but also the most dire. And it was interesting. In these areas, you can't really find a lot of good historical data sets to sort of look at how much rainfall there has been, accurately over the past 20 years. And so the best way that I mean, it's not, journalistically, it's the hard part about reporting for the climate desk is everybody wants data, like hard data, and climate change is all data-based. But one of the things that I found interesting in places like this was talking to old people and trying to understand the ecology from the area just off of oral histories. And so I used to ask them, like, what was growing here when you were a child? What was the forest like? So this area, which was, people here don't even grow anything anymore because there's not enough groundwater, and the rains don't come hardly at all anymore. Whatever comes gets absorbed really quickly, and then the wells are still dry. But a lot of the sort of village elders there told me that when they were kids, there were berries that grew wild, and that the forest was full of wild pigs and monkeys and other animals, and all that's gone now, they said. And that they used to grow year-round, or at least 2 crops a year. And now, if they're lucky, they can grow a single crop of lentils. And most of the people are either working in rock crushing. I asked them, why are you still here? How are you still here? And they said, all of our children are working in cities. And it made me think if, this period of growth that India is going through, which is dramatically lifted a lot of the country. Like, what if those jobs are lost? What do these communities do? There's for every job lost here, there's a village that's being sunk deeper into poverty elsewhere. So this was a well that they had dug about 10 years ago, they said, but 2 years ago it just stopped refilling, and it hasn't filled up since. And yeah, so one of the things, sorry, these are a little bit out of sequence. I'm jumping around a lot, but I had a better edit, but this is you're getting the New York Times version, so I'm hopping around. But so this was in Taimur Nagar here in Delhi, and it's not, to me, it's not just, a lot of people see this and they see the garbage, but what's interesting about this is that this is one of the sort of original creeks that used to run through Delhi and acted as like a natural drain into the Yamuna during the rainy season. And those creeks used to also recharge Delhi's groundwater supplies. As they flowed, water would seep into the ground and replenish the aquifer that sits underneath the city. And Indian cities, as we all know, are running through their groundwater at a remarkable pace. In Taimur Nagar? Taimur Nagar, yeah. So this is just, a lot of these, like the Barapula waterway, at various points, they're all sort of clogged, either paved over or clogged with refuse. And this is, this is central Delhi for the most part. This isn't in a suburb. This is sort of, a municipal crisis in many ways, I thought. So. Go to the next one. So this was the section we did on Marathwada, which was in western Maharashtra, and was the area where, farmers have seen, consecutive years of drought and crop failures. This year was another year of drought, and they also had pests attack their millet and their corn, and they're only about 20 kilometers away from like a pretty large sugarcane growing area, which is receiving subsidies, and it sort of was a way to sort of look at how things are very unequal even in the rural areas when it comes to water. And And yeah, so there was like armyworm and then one other pest that came in and attacked the corn and the millet, and then also the cotton is failing this year as well. And let's see here. And yeah, so, I mean, a lot of my, it got a little repetitive trying to figure out new ways to show how people were relating to their water, but one of the things I thought was important to show was just what are people's daily interactions with water? How, do they have to walk there? It's, especially when you're shooting for like an American audience, you kind of have to, there's a lot of things that for you and for me even seem sort of average, run-of-the-mill, innocuous, but for them it's important to show them sort of the process of, for some people it doesn't just come out of the faucet, basically. So, and then this was in another area of UP outside Fatehpur, which I also visited. And had a lot of the similar issues that Sonbhadra had, but here in particular, they were, also sort of steadily seeing the monsoon change and also seeing their groundwater supplies dwindle drastically. The groundwater supplies were falling by 20 to 30 feet a year in some areas. And it created this new economy, which is if you were a farmer that could afford a bore well, you could also rent that bore well out to your neighbors. And the government, as far as I could tell, was essentially absent from the area. They had bore wells that functioned maybe 20 years ago, but then they never dug them deeper, so they're sort of kaput at this point. And so with no government solutions, this sort of local economy of scarcity has taken over, and it's turned, from what I understood, there used to be more sort of equality amongst the farmers in terms of incomes and whatnot, but now it's becoming more feudal in a lot of ways. Like certain farmers have more power and other farmers are being pushed lower, basically. So it is exacerbating, a sort of microcosm of inequality amongst like a small agrarian population, basically.
You have caste divisions in the village?
You had some, but the real divisions in those villages now are age divisions. You go into those villages and, there's nobody between the ages of 12 and 50. They're all working in the cities. They've all moved on. You see locked houses and the farmers will tell you it's a constant battle to figure out how much land you can actually grow on because you don't know if you're going to have enough money to rent enough water for it, basically. And you can sort of be ruined, obviously in one go. Even if your crop doesn't fail, you just spend too much money on water. Yeah, exactly. And then you go into the villages where you have like one government provided drinking water pump, basically, that's run off of electricity, but there's no electricity in the village. And I watched as these guys sort of sat around with the village head and angrily called the power company to try to get them to turn on the water. They said it maybe comes on once an hour every 2 days or so. But that sort of idea of like getting somebody to turn on the electricity so that the water pump would work was interesting. So a lot of it's sort of reverting to private solutions, from the private sector, which are not necessarily efficient or beneficial to the local environment, especially considering how far ground level waters are dropping. So this is back in Sonbhadra, where I was there in June, and farmers were getting ready to burn to fertilize because they would be planting around the monsoon in hopes that that their lentils would grow, but everybody was sort of not very optimistic. And this is back near Fatehpur, where, people talk a lot about farmers, but also the herders. Herders have also suffered. Like, the whole ecology of the farming herding cycle seems to be failing. Like, this was a shepherd named Saktopal who said that in the last 15 years, his flock has shrunk by about 20%, mostly because his animals get sick during the dry season. They don't have enough food. And he would graze on people's farms so that the animals would fertilize the land, basically. So the whole system is stressed and breaking down in places, from what I could see. And yeah, so this is the section on sort of the floods in Mumbai, and it was, I don't know. Floods I found to be very hard to cover because they happen really fast and they're oftentimes very difficult to get to. So I got one day. I happened to be in Mumbai one day when the rains came, and went out to to cover what was happening along the Mithi, because I know that it's its potential sort of has a very great potential for flooding and danger to the community. So. And yeah, so it was a lot of, it was interesting to see because people are obviously used to it there. It's been part of their lives. You can go to the next one. And everybody seems to have sort of a system for, they know that they have to, when the water's coming, they have to take the refrigerator and put the refrigerator upstairs and turn off all the electricity, and then it's everybody sort of has their checklist basically that they run through, as you know. And yeah, so this is the last one in the Times article, but it made me, I don't know, this one thing that I thought a lot about shooting this story over the year was that water is water. Everybody needs it, and people will take whatever water they can find. Whether it's clean, dirty, and they'll take what they can get. And this issue in particular, I didn't want to. Obviously, I didn't want to focus specifically on poverty, but I think it's important. And I think of all this work as the beginning of a sort of longer series on climate issues surrounding water, earth, air that I'll focus on in India. And I didn't want to just focus on poverty in this specific story, but at the same time, I think of, I look at this election that just happened, and I see that climate change and pollution, these things aren't even political issues for most Indians. It didn't even register in this year's national elections. And, I think that as well, climate change is going to impact all of us very differently. It will discriminate based on class, especially, for many of us, we might have the ability we might have the financial ability to find ways around it, basically, but the people that will be impacted in the most severe way are going to be the people who are already the most vulnerable. So that's basically it for now. I hope that was cohesive.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to open the room to questions, but I just wanted to start by asking, obviously, when you undertake a project of this scope, like you're looking at water in a country of 1.3 billion people, I'm sure you were taking a lot of pictures, and I'm sure a lot of them, couldn't make it into what is increasingly needs to be for our audiences digestible and, relatively short, right? So how did you decide kind of how to curate this gallery? And I was also curious, because I think increasingly photos, in part because newsrooms are getting smaller, like photographers and writers are working together more and more as sort of collaborators, right? So both are seen as both are seen as reporters, essentially.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, did you pick sort of a sequence of photos, or was a sequence of photos chosen and then the text you guys wrote sort of around the photos, or was it the other way around? Did you write the story and then decide which photos to illustrate it?
No, we. It's funny. It's a good question. So I actually edited it with my editor in New York, and basically it was this. It was, as you said, like we sort of picked the sequence and then moved. We already had the text, but we kind of we cut out actual strips of it and figured out kind of where everything was going to fit based on the photo sequence. And yeah, it is true. Like now, I think especially at the New York Times, more than a lot of other foreign outlets like the Washington Post or Time Magazine or the Guardian, photographers now are becoming like a larger part of the reporting process. And part of that's being driven by kind of the growth of online, sort of the online presence of the paper, which is now in many ways more important than like the physical paper. The physical paper, for a story like this, maybe if it was like really done big, we would get like 3 pictures in the paper, 4 pictures in the paper. And now with the, now that you have sort of the rich formats online, the Times is experimenting with things called like photo first, where photos will actually guide the story, and that's nice because newspapers have been run by writers for a long time, so it's nice to be treated like a first-class citizen. So
okay, I also wanted to ask about the hygiene aspect of this, because you're standing in this water clearly, like to give readers and viewers the perspective that you have and the perspective that people who live with these situations have. Not only are you standing in fetid water, but then sometimes you're standing in extreme heat in desert. And I'm just curious if you could talk about, you've been at this for a while, like kind of what precautions you take, any suggestions you may have for how people cover climate when it's just physically really uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous to do so.
Yeah,
And not just standing in water, because it was raining also, and one of the how you protect your equipment and how to
Yeah.
protect that.
well, I don't do a very good job of protecting my equipment. That they're punished. My cameras are punished terribly over the year. But I didn't do a very good job of protecting myself on this assignment. I was on antibiotics like at least once this year. My bacterial bingo card for 2019 is full. I win. And the Yamuna for Chath Puja was definitely the most hardcore thing I did. But yeah, I don't really take. I didn't really take precautions. Like I wore sandals on the day going into the Yamuna because I figure it's better than having all that stuck to your feet all the time. After you get out. I just kind of charged in and did it because I think that's how you get the more important, sort of indelible pictures. And usually for extreme heat, like I just do what the locals do, which is, nobody works in the middle of the day. You walk around in the middle of the day, they're like, what are you doing? And we're not doing that. Like we work in the mornings and the evenings. Like it's 50 degrees out. Like just sit in the shade. So.
Okay, then one more question, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. So I was reading some of the responses to the piece online, and some of them, actually one of them that I noticed said, this is going to be portrayed as anti-Modi propaganda. And that sounds really silly, except that I think we can all agree that it's getting increasingly difficult, and we increasingly have to defend ourselves from attacks from the current government. So I'm wondering, did you get any response from the government where you called in and lectured on this one?
No, I wasn't. And I find that globally. I worked in China for a while, and I've worked, across the Middle East in authoritarian, places. I'm not saying India is authoritarian, but people usually treat. I don't know. There's some disconnect between people treat photographers differently. You know, for some reason, I think it's harder to argue with photographs than it is to argue with words. For now, at least, you know, we are sort of at the precipice of the era of deep fakes and things like that. So I'm waiting for like the first deep fake photojournalism picture to accidentally get published on like the front page of a newspaper, and then everybody will be like, see, fake news. But no, I don't know. Maybe they don't take us that seriously, because I don't know, photojournalism, you know, people think of us as these sort of like, we're kind of artists, we're kind of journalists, we're, you know, people have this vision of us being bon vivants and not very serious people, but it's, you know, it's
Not true.
not true. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I don't know, I haven't gotten any pushback. I do get pushback sometimes from you know, people. I get pushback from a lot of Indian readers who are upset because they feel like this is playing off of sort of the typical tropes of, you know, of the way India's historically been portrayed. You know, is whether it's poor or, you know, they're, you know, it's tough to. You know, it's tough to not. I find it's very difficult in some stories to not offend people, you know, in that way. I find I always have somebody taking issue. But politically, I haven't had any pushback.
All right, well, does anybody have a question?
Myself, Raghu from ZDF. Yeah, it's the same. You just said you did not get pushbacks. And could it be that photographs are more subjective, also more objective, and somebody who is trying to criticize it would find it difficult because you see what it is there, at least on the face of it, you did not made up the scene. So unless the scene is made up, it's an objective, and that's why people find it difficult to raise objections to that or criticize, one thing. And secondly, before you told me that it was in Mumbai, the picture with the raindrops in front of you. So it's flooding, I suppose. Okay, with the dry place where there are droughts, you can go with water bottles, but in floods, it's very difficult to reach a particular place to take picture. So I was just, had it been really flooded for several kilometers or maybe 40, 50 kilometers, the whole area city, then did you, this was, of course, you did not travel for this in water for very long, but that would be very difficult to do if, had it been the whole area being, you have to travel maybe boat for several kilometers to take pictures. Yeah. Was it done or not? Or something?
No, so I'll talk about Mumbai first. So the Mumbai, you know, basically the Mithi River, which sort of empties into the bay, has this like one transit point where it goes past the airport and, you know, near Sion and Dharavi, and those areas are, you have, you have a lot of development there. You have high rises. It's dense sort of mixed, a mix of neighborhoods basically. But a lot of the sort of more densely populated lower income areas are stacked right up on the riverbank basically. And the structures are not as, they're not as sound in a lot of ways as, some of the other stuff that's a little bit further up the bank. And so when the river floods, it floods like any river would. The water will sort of come to a certain level and find its way to, to that high water mark. So because you're on the bank, you're not walking through like large, the floodplain is kind of narrow but long in a lot of places. So I wasn't walking too far to get into the water, but there was, you'd have a stretch of road that was half a kilometer long that was, under 3 feet of water or 4 feet of water, depending on where. And the most dangerous part was like not knowing where the potholes or the manholes were. Sort of like making sure you don't. No, just wore sandals. So, yeah. And and the first question was about. Oh yeah, I think it's. I've never. I think it's a lot easier to disagree with words and to shape words to your narrative. when you're telling a story. And I think people are aware of that, governments are aware of that, and so they have entire communications and sections of ministries that are dedicating to getting a message out, to disseminating the official line and arguing with any line that doesn't sort of match that, basically. But photographs, you can't really, you can fake them, but you can always, usually, I feel like I can spot fake photographs. It's not that hard. When you see something staged, there's like a smell to it. It seems kind of off. And it is, it is like one of the mortal cardinal sins in our industry. If you get caught doing it by an editor, you're done. Like, you'll never work again. So yeah, I don't know. That's one of the reasons I love photography. Is it's much harder to argue with the photograph than it is to argue with words. So.
Hi, I'm Betwa Sharma from the Huffington Post. I was wondering if, do you still, I noticed that you're an independent journalist, so do you still pitch stories? And has it become easier to sort of get climate change stories placed? Because, there was this time when it was, I still think it is very difficult to get people interested in climate change stories. So I was wondering what the pitching process is now. If you come to think of it, COP25 has happened or is going on, and there was very, very little coverage of it. So what's the pitching process like, and is it easier for, to get climate change stories in now?
Gotcha. I'm technically an independent photographer. I've been shooting with the New York Times since 2005, and really I've been doing almost all of my work for them since 2011. Because they sort of keep me busy, but they're also, like everybody else in the industry, like the idea of hiring a staff photojournalist these days seems like totally ridiculous to most newspapers. They're like, there's so many of you, like, we can just find somebody else if you don't want to work for no money, and which is frustrating, obviously, but and the Times is better than most, but still not that great, It was funny, I was joking with Ravi Mishra, who is my producer on this story, and I was telling him, like, brother, like, after I pay taxes, like, you're actually making more than I am for this, with the New York Times day rate. But yeah, in terms of climate, the New York Times now has a climate desk and is taking climate change very seriously. They have a dozen reporters and editors working on that desk that are, not only doing their own reporting, but they're also being tasked to help, like, members of the foreign desk and the business desk when they're writing about stories that have climate angles on them, because it is very science-driven. I argued with Samini a lot. I was like, we should do this. She's like, there's no data on that. I'm like, I don't care. She's like, yeah, but the desk cares. Like, this isn't the foreign desk. You can't just, go write about what it feels like to be in, like, with, tigers in the forest. This isn't the type of Indian reporting we're doing here. It's data-driven. And so my pitching process was, I pitched sort of one of the editors that I know, who's kind of outside of my usual foreign picture desk sort of line of communication, because I hadn't ever dealt with the climate desk before, and she sort of carried it through, and I do work for other people, but I don't do so in India because I'm told they would get angry at me because I'm not allowed to do that because I am on the Times visa here. So yeah, that's it. Sure.
It was actually related to what you were saying earlier, like people sometimes feel, the whole stereotyping, looking at India, images of poverty and so on. So I'm just wondering if you, how do you deal with that? Because I'm sure you're conscious of that going into the, how do you deal with that? Like, when you're taking a photo of I don't know, poverty, do you feel that, oh my God, this photo is like, I'm going to get pushback on it? Or do you somehow feel that you're focusing on things which, are kind of typical or stereotypical as well?
It's a good question. I don't know. When I'm shooting, I'm just kind of shooting, And I do a lot. I usually do a lot of research with the people I work with beforehand about like, where I want to go, and why do I want to go there. Particularly for this story, like the closing image of what I showed you of the guy bathing, and that was in the Barapula waterway, which is, one of the key examples of how Delhi has kind of been paved over and how Delhi's, water ecosystem has kind of been, destroyed by lack of planning and its, sort of urbanization and development. Coincidentally, the image was, I find that image to be kind of one of the most stereotypical pictures of the entire set, probably. If I think of like all the other, pictures that have, I don't know, it's that combination of like the incredible India ads, but with poverty that I really find troublesome. And so I do kind of try to get away, I try to get away from that. But I also don't believe in like India has dramatic inequality. Dramatic. It's one of the most pernicious issues, that despite all this growth in the economy here that's taken place, like you still have, elevating people out of dire poverty and out of dire water insecurity and out of dire food insecurity has been a real challenge. And I don't think it's honest to try to ignore that just to paint a rosier picture, And I also don't, I believe in the value of having outsiders document your country. Like, arguably the best piece of photojournalism ever created in the United States, The Americans by Robert Frank. Robert Frank was a Hungarian Jewish immigrant, and he sort of did the defining work on what's sort of thought to be the sort of golden era of American power in the 50s and 60s. So I think we all have voices, and we all have, contributions we can make. And particularly with something like climate change that's going to impact all of us in one way or another, no matter where we live in the world. I think it's important to, that we all sort of have a voice. Hope that makes sense.
Hi, Bryan. I'm Rakesh Nagar, independent video journalist, but photography as well. I want to ask, you touched upon a little bit on that, that is how much you study before starting a project, according to photo, because there are two kind of photo video journalists. They just pick a bag and go and start taking pictures, and other is that they study a lot and then go and work in the field, and how much that matters to produce pictures.
Yeah, I think it depends on the story. Some stories you just kind of go, and this story though this story I found particularly challenging because there was a lot of stuff based on when Samini and I finally agreed on an idea, and then when the deadline was, it was just not accessible due to the season. A lot of, when you're covering climate change, a lot of things, things might be there in February and March, but they're not going to be there in June and July. And so, when I was researching, I was finding a lot of things that I wanted to cover, but I just didn't have the time because it wasn't the proper time of year, basically. And I pushed really hard to get them to give me like another 6 months on this because I was like, I need to do this, I need to do that. But I researched a fair amount, and I researched with, obviously I'm not, by no means am I an expert on India, but I was lucky enough to work with Ravi, who I'm sure some of you know, and is extremely knowledgeable on, he's traveled this country up and down, and has a really strong network of locals all over the place who, oftentimes I would hire them just to go check something out. Be like, hey, what's happening here now? What is the, some of these places like Sonbhadra, for instance, there's no cell towers there. There's no electricity. So how do you call people? You can't even call to check what the situation is. So you send people, and get them to, And Ravi was very good about, you know, sort of asking targeted questions about sort of what the situation was, and you know, what were the conditions like, and you know, and so that was sort of our method of doing research, at least for some of the areas. So yeah, it was pretty heavily researched, but then some areas we were just like, you know what, let's go spend another 3 days here and see what we find. And sometimes we found nothing, and sometimes we found stuff that we thought was important. So yeah.
Hi, Brian. I'm Vikram. I work for Fortunate. We work in strategic communications. Great that you traveled all through India. I have two set of questions. One, apart from the local villages and all, did you take support from any of the friends or colleagues in the media before embarking on pitching for this story, or even collaborating for this story?
I didn't. Let's see. I'm trying to remember back to sort of the genesis of this. I mean, one thing that I looked at that I sort of read front to back that started me thinking about water was that the Niti Aayog report on, you know, particularly on India's cities, you know, coming to the ends of their groundwater supplies. And who else did I talk to? I worked a little bit with WaterAid in Fatehpur, you know, they were a WaterAid supported charity. Then I'd have to look at my notes, but I worked with some of their activists just to sort of get an idea of what was happening. I mean, usually in these areas, I was usually talking to either activists or NGO people who were helping sort of guide me in my reporting, being like, you know, this is an important village that you should look at. They're having trouble. You know, these are sort of the circumstances that, you know, are leading to the water shortage for them. So yeah, so that was basically it. But here, in the lead up to pitching this, I just used my trusty friend Google, and did most of my research that way. And also talked to Ravi, and I talked to Samini as well. Samini used to be the bureau chief in India, so she's already very, very knowledgeable about you know, about sort of particularly water, because she's done some reporting on it before. So. Yeah, Samini Sengupta. Yeah.
My second question, in which I'll
Sure.
have a couple of pointers, is you showed that well which was dug 10 years ago, which you said was one of the most remotest areas that you have visited in Uttar Pradesh, and it has dried up 2 years ago. Did you come across your research or your study or your travels, any of the success stories where conservation done at the local level, by the village level, has really transformed that community, both in aspect of changing the SDG aspect as well as the economy? Because you mentioned that between 12 to 50, you hardly find people in a lot of places where they are there, because that segment of the population is going to the cities. But did you come across any of these success stories where this transformation has not only affected the ecological part, but the economical part as well?
It's a very good question, and that was actually part of the reason why I wanted another 6 months to work on this story, was which I was denied, unfortunately. But no, I wanted to do another section on solutions, because I think if you look at, I'll go into your world for a sec, communication strategists have actually said that the most effective way of reporting on climate change isn't to only focus on the disaster, but also to focus on solutions as well. So I had pushed to go up to Leh to look at the sort of construction of the ice stupas, which have apparently this year they've done a competition amongst villages, so they're sort of expanding the construction of those stupas. And for those of you, I'm sure all of you know about them, but for those of you who don't, they're basically a way of storing water during the dry winters, you know, to be used for agriculture in the following year. But that, and then I was also looking for success stories, and will continue to look for success stories as I continue reporting, and on this subject. But yeah, I do think it's very important to show those. But unfortunately, I ran out of time. I was too busy trying to build like the air and the earth segments of the story, and it's sort of in one of its many conceptions that Samini and I came up with, but ended up not going with. So,
My
yeah.
second pointer is you showed that Temur Lane,
Temur
or
Nagar, yeah.
Temur Lane in Delhi, which on that creek, which the garbage is lined up and it's
Yeah.
awful, which doesn't allow the water, groundwater to be recharged. Did you during your research or during your travels come across places where industry is affecting that groundwater or commercialization is affecting that groundwater? Especially, let's consider there's been a lot of comment, a lot of work done on especially the beverages industry, where they take up a lot of groundwater, and that's constantly, not only in India, across the globe, an
Yeah.
issue, and it has almost the same kind of impact.
Yeah.
Did you touch upon that?
I didn't have time to touch upon that, but it's funny that you mentioned that because I've been looking into that recently, which is just looking at how companies in India deal with water and how water is apportioned to private industry, and particularly to industrialists, because I think that that's a really, India's relationship with its industrialists is a
Yeah.
really complicated one.
Yes.
That, I don't know, I'm doing a lot of reporting on stuff now about that, so, which should hopefully be out soon. So I'm gonna no comment on that.
Yeah.
I'll comment on that in the Times soon.
Thank you.
You talked about serving in Africa before coming to India.
Mostly Middle East, but some
parts of Africa.
North Africa, a lot of North Africa.
So I'm just intrigued. I mean, what's the difference between covering Africa, covering India? What's the contrast? I mean, one, from what they let you do or what you found there, discovered there, was it interesting? Were you doing more conflict than contemporary stories like this one? And secondly, I mean, you must have chosen, or New York Times has certainly chosen climate change as a focus, and it interests you.
Yeah.
One can tell from the pictures. So, are you, as an independent photojournalist, driven by a certain passion, a certain, desire to cover certain subjects?
Yeah, so I mean, Africa and India are so different. I mean, India, India's going to surpass China in 3 to 5 years as the most populous nation in the world. And, Africa is like the least dense in terms of population, as a continent globally. So it's, maybe Australia is the least dense. I'm not sure. But,
As a continent, Australia, yes.
yeah.
But it's definitely.
Yeah, Africa is definitely less dense than India, So I mean, working in those countries, which are, one of the projects I did there was about sort of great apes in the Congo and how they were increasingly being poached, and I did like a 600, I think it was 600 kilometer like dugout canoe trip up the Congo River, and it was, you go hours without seeing a single person, or
DRC.
yeah, DRC. You travel 70 kilometers and you don't see a single human being or a single sign of human life, which obviously you can't travel 25 kilometers in India without hitting a population center.
0.5
So India is, very different, but India is also super rich, and I find India to be incredibly easy to work in. People are friendly for the most part. I don't find people to be people are curious, but they're not they're not as aggressive as people I've encountered in North Africa, the Middle East. Like I've worked in places like Algeria, where just the culture around photography is one of tremendous suspicion, whereas here, like most of the time it's people saying, "Hey, let me get a selfie with you." It's so I find India to be a joy to work in. And the way that I came to climate change is I did cover conflict, particularly in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Egypt. For the majority of my career, for about 10 years. But I got hurt in Iraq in 2016 at the very beginning of the Mosul offensive, and I was lucky. I got a minor injury. During the opening days of the battle, I'd been doing it for so long that I took about a year to think about it and decide whether or not I really wanted to go back to that. And I don't know if I will, but at the time I just thought, I need to do something different. And I was also getting tired of just photographing the same sort of cycle of human behavior that doesn't seem to lead anywhere. It's just, it's like a carousel of misery where, like, by the time you're getting off the refugee boat, you're going back into the fighting, and then it's at least personally, and it was starting to have a impact on my life, I saw my son growing up and becoming more aware, and so I decided to, and I didn't want him to sort of be worried about me when I was traveling, and I also care about, I'm a kid from California, we're very conscientious about the environment, and I've seen, my state change a lot, and I think that climate change is going to be, in many ways the defining story of the next 3 or 4 decades, and it's going to, unite and divide all of us, I'm sure, but it's also a really big challenge to photograph, because it's really hard to get a picture of, like, something where you can say this is climate change. It's not, you can get a picture that says, like, this is war or this is a humanitarian emergency, but climate change is hard to photograph. It's hard, like, you're talking about geological time or meteorological time, I guess, and that's a lot slower than, the way that humans sort of perceive time in a lot of ways, or maybe faster now, since the projections for climate change don't seem to be, dramatic enough. It seems like the Earth is warming faster than we thought. So, who knows?
I sort of heard you say that while India is very challenging, but it's fun to cover things here. Compared with whatever you've done in the rest of the world, do you find it easier to do your work here? Do people, there'll always be critics of media people, but do you find sort of on a percentage ratio basis less criticism here, or not so much? It's not, people don't get really upset and angry. They just say whatever they have to say. And how long would you want to stay in India and do things?
So, yeah, I find definitely more criticism, but less danger, and I'll take that any day. It's I prefer criticism to danger. But yeah, in terms of staying here, so I'm actually, the only reason I'm here is because my wife is actually a South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. She's a writer. We're a journalist couple, and I don't know how it works, but like, we both travel a lot, and somehow we have kids, and it all somehow comes together. But her posting is sort of what keeps us here, and we'll be here for, I think, 3 to 5 years is her commitment, and we just finished. This is basically year 2 for us, so we've got it. No, Maria Abi Habib. So that's my wife. I'm Mr. Abi Habib, basically.
No. You came to India around the same time.
Yeah, roughly. I think Jeffrey got here maybe 6 to 9 months ahead of us, basically. Yeah. So. Yeah.
This is Ravi Misra from Uday India Magazine.
Ah.
Actually, I just saw a picture of Mumbai. There was a picture of waterlogging. You have chosen a slum area.
Mm-hmm.
But waterlogging was everywhere. Even in Bandra also, there was a waterlogging.
Yeah.
So you could have chosen Bandra also, but you have chosen the slum area.
True.
And it is said that Western media always try to show the bad picture of India, because they underestimate the Indian economy, they underestimate the power of India. So don't you think that photographs and articles nowadays are being used for propaganda?
I don't necessarily think it's propaganda, and I didn't choose the area because it was a slum area. I chose the area because it was on the Methi River, which is, has a history, has a documented history of being overdeveloped, and which has led to, helped contribute to the factors that increase incidents of flooding. And in 2005, I think it was 2005 or 2006, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the date, but you had that disastrous incident where the Mithi, where you had, days and days of rains combined with a dramatic high tide where the Mithi broke its banks, and then, you had over 1,000 people killed as a result. Because that area is incredibly densely built, and it's and the conditions along that specific body of water in those specific neighborhoods have made it, a place that is, sort of dramatically affected by even small changes in the climate. So it wasn't, that area, there were waterlogged areas in other parts of the city, but that might have been because of drain blockages. It might have been because of other elements of the local topography that might have contributed slightly to a lack of drainage for the area. But what drew me to that area specifically was the fact that it was on the Mithi River. And that area happens to be, a mixed bag of neighborhoods. And I have other pictures that were from that same area where the water was a little bit lower, and I had pictures of economic activity in that area, and those were middle-class areas. But the highest water was in, Sion, was in another neighborhood, but it's just across from the airport runway, but I can't remember. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
And you talked about that climate change and water was not the issue in elections. But this is not true. Even in BJP and Congress manifesto, water was a issue.
Yeah.
They had talked about that when they will come into power, they will work on this. And even the government is also working on this. So this was the issue, but because of the, we have a very different politics. Our political system is very different than US and other people also, other parts of other countries also. So that's why it doesn't able to become an issue, but it is always an issue. So the government is whoever, even BJP has come to power, they are working, they have formed a separate ministry, Jal Shakti. So this is, you can't say that the government is not serious about this. This is the wrong, you are just spreading wrong rumors in the world, I think so. We have an issue, we are working on this. We have the policy, yes. Even plastic, we are just banning plastic also. So we are very much concerned about climate change. US and China, I think US and China are the main body which are creating much more carbon. We are very much low. We are creating very low carbon,
That's true. As at the moment, the US and China are the world's largest, carbon, emissions, producers. I think that it's a complicated, as a country as India grows, just the way sort of China went through its revolution of sort of building its economy over the last 30 or 40 years since their opening. How do you combine development with environmental sort of concerns? And nobody has the answer to that question yet. China has a very different system than India. India's democracy is like this amazing, but in many ways, frustrating thing, I think, for people who are trying to affect change. I watched in China as China was like, the Beijing air is really dirty. We're going to evict 500,000 people from the suburbs in a weekend, essentially. And they did it. And it fixed things temporarily, but what about those 500,000 people? I don't think I have the answer to them, and I'm not trying to paint propaganda, but the issues are real. And they're, while they are part of the political conversation here, like you have, tons of farmer protests, you have these issues in the political conversation. They're not at the forefront. But India is in a particularly precarious position for its, with climate change. By 2050, the World Bank estimates, I think, that half of India's population is going to be, see their economic fortunes depressed by rising temperatures and water scarcity. So, I think that, as I said before, climate change is, much like, the world, it's vastly unequal. Certain places are going to be affected, more rapidly and more severely than others. And what I was saying was, it's not that, I'm not saying that Indians aren't conscientious of climate change. Of course they are, but the sense of urgency, particularly in a place that's going to be feeling the effects and impacts dramatically, in rapid fashion, don't seem to be on par with, with the amount of attention that's being given. Particularly when you have, big investment in sort of coal energy moving forward, some of the agricultural policies revolving around sugarcane, which is India's the world's largest sugar producer. It's a cash crop, but it's not something that is sustainable moving forward, even in the short term. So, sure.
I would like to just make a comment. Everyone in the world says that, look, there is a farm distress in India. But the problem is that nobody's trying to understand why this is. Earlier I had written an article. We had a very different family system. We were united earlier, but because of westernization, our family is being split. We are separating ourselves. We are following nuclear family policy. So that's why the land is also being separated. So that's why, due to the packeting of lands, small packeting of lands, the cost is increasing. That is a real problem, I think so. But nobody raised this point. That's the problem. Yes. Yes.
Indian farming policy is hugely complicated in a lot of ways, and the way that land is apportioned between, in these districts is like I don't understand the economics of it completely because I'm not an agricultural specialist, but looking at some of the plots that these farmers were growing on, I couldn't help but wonder, like, how do they survive? You're growing on maybe 1 acre. Like, how do you subsist for a year off of what you can produce on 1 acre, especially when because of a increasingly erratic monsoon, your access to water is uncertain. Like that, that's a question that even those farmers don't seem to have an answer to increasingly. And the policy, it's not to say that there aren't solutions, but everywhere I went, there seemed to be palpable anger at the government, And it wasn't at what the government was doing, it was that the government wasn't doing anything, like in Fatehpur, those areas, Sonbhadra, people were like, we see our politician once every 5 years when he comes to like ask for our votes, and then we never see him again. And, and people were cursing them, both parties. They didn't care. It was just, they were like, one thing somebody said to me was, they want us to be beholden to them so that we have to vote for them, basically. So it's, to me, it's in some of these places I went to, I couldn't even see policy. Like in Sonbhadra, they kept on joking, like the government came and they put up power poles, but they forgot the power lines. Like, there were no power lines, for 10 years. And it's, and most of those people who, you talked about the breakup of the nuclear family, those farming communities are now split up with people going to work in rock crushing, people going to work in big cities, kids not going to school because there's, a lot of the schools in the area just don't operate. So yeah, it's you're right. These disruptions, the difference in just something as simple as rain create huge societal disruptions, as does growing economies. So yeah.
All right, well, thank you everybody so much for this great conversation. I think it's a reminder of how wonderful it is that we have a space where people born here or who've lived here a long time can discuss things with people who are coming at this relatively new and from other places. I think it's really, really a testament to what this institution is about. So I want to thank you again, Bryan, for really, really fascinating talk and sharing your photos with us and sharing the backstory. And yeah, I hope to see you all at the next one next month.
And thank you all for tolerating me.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. So, and ladies, so we're going to have this once a month, and very soon we will be having a coffee place upstairs. It's going to be called Breaking Brews, and we also are planning to have a media room where you can bring your laptops, sit there and use our, 4G connectivity, and have a coffee and do your thing and so on. Thank you very much. Good night.